Thank you, gentlemen. Steve, as always, you bring us very interesting and thought-provoking subjects. And I appreciate very much the FBI's cooperation in providing Mr. Cummings for us today. As we looked on the agenda, as we were forming the agenda this year, one of the things that became apparent is we had an unusual opportunity to tell a story of a security issue and have with the potential of getting the crew involved to tell their own story. A lot of cooperation had to occur to get this done. United Airlines 855, a 777 en route from Miami to Buenos Aires, made the front page of the paper due to an extremely disruptive passenger that elected to try to take over the airplane. The story is much better told by the crew, so I won't spoil that. But I would like to acknowledge the amount of cooperation it took to get these three gentlemen in front of you today. United Airlines, Captain Hank Rakowski, Captain Paul Whiteford, their MEC chairman, Captain Rory Kay, their Central Safety Committee chairman, Captain Dan Kirk, the captain on 855, First Officer Mike Covington, and First Officer Scott Laffman, all worked together to get schedules adjusted and to take the time to be here. And collectively, gentlemen, I appreciate that. It's awfully easy sometimes just to listen to a speaker, but in this case we thought that a video might be more telling. So we have for you the story of United Airlines 855.
On February 6, 2002, at 11:55 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, a United Boeing 777 departed Miami International Airport bound for Buenos Aires with 142 passengers and 15 crew members on board.
My name is Dan Kerr. I'm a 777 captain in Miami. I was the captain on Flight 855, February 6th of 2002, from Miami to Buenos Aires.
We were about halfway into the flight, about 3.5 hours, and Mike, the relief pilot, and myself were in the cockpit, and Dan, the captain, was back on his break.
After we had finished our service and put away most of our carts, I was standing in the business class galley when I noticed that there was a passenger walking very quickly by the business class on the right side of the aircraft. A few minutes prior, the rest of the crew and I had just made a circuit through the cabins, first and business class. We had 4 passengers in first class and 27 passengers in business class. We realized that everyone was sleeping, so it seemed a little strange that there was someone walking by, and walking by rather quickly. I looked out of the side of the cabin, of the side of the galley, and I followed the gentleman up into the first class galley. He stopped in the first class galley where all the lights were on, and I could see him clearly. And I asked the gentleman, "Sir, would you mind returning back to coach if you need to use the restroom? Otherwise, you need to return to coach and sit down." He pushed past me out of the first class galley, through the cross aisle, rounded the corner, and headed up to the cockpit door. He stood in front of the cockpit door and didn't do anything. He didn't go to the left or the right, which is where the lavatories are. And again, I asked him, I said, "Sir, please, could you just return to the coach cabin? If you need to use the restrooms, those are the restrooms that you need to use." He reached out and grabbed the handle of the cockpit door. And it was really at this point that I knew that something was wrong.
So Terrence picked up the phone and called us. He told me that there was someone outside the door who was refusing to return to his seat when asked. And it appeared that he was also attempting to manipulate the cockpit doorknob. I heard the rattle of the cockpit doorknob. I told Scott, the other co-pilot, that I was going to get out of the seat and check, see what was going on outside the door, during which I continued to hold the cockpit interphone handset in my hand.
I was walking towards one left, and I saw Terrence calling the cockpit. Somehow I knew something was very wrong.
When he heard me call the cockpit, he really started pounding very, very hard on the door. When he heard me talking to the cockpit, he turned around and started kicking the door.
The individual made his first blow against the door, at which time I told the flight attendant to wake the captain from the crew rest facility.
There were several more violent crashes against the door, and after I noticed that the bottom panel appeared to be separating from the door, I turned to Mike and I told Mike to get the crash axe. Well, I guess great minds think alike, because as soon as the words came out of my mouth, he was in the process of going for the axe.
Once I had the crash axe in my hand, I began trying to observe through the viewport, whenever possible, what was going on outside.
At that point, I left to call for help to one right, where I knew there were male passengers. There were 3 male passengers, big and strong guys in there. So I shouted as loud as I could, and they came running right behind me.
Remembering what happened on September 11th and thinking that any available resistance had been swept aside by the perpetrator or the perpetrators, I considered disconnecting the autopilot and putting the aircraft into some banking maneuvers in order to immobilize or destabilize or undermine the footing of the person trying to beat down the door and get in the cockpit. So I turned around and told Mike that I was going to disconnect the autopilot, maneuver in the airplane. He was looking through the peephole, and he advised me that probably might not be the best thing to do, since there were some flight attendants standing up. Well, not wanting to hurt the flight attendants, the good guys, I decided to leave the autopilot on and keep the airplane in a straight and level attitude.
I was on rest break, and a rare occasion I was actually sleeping very well. I think I'd probably been sleeping about 50 minutes when a flight attendant grabbed me. And the words were something to the effect of, "We have an emergency, we need you now."
There were several other violent crashes against the door, and while the retention bar was holding, the door, quite frankly, was coming apart. The bottom panel had separated even more, and I was concerned that the door was going to break free of the hinges. So I got on the PA, and I made a PA announcement. I said, "Would the flight attendants please come forward and defend the cockpit door against an intruder?"
I was at 4 left, and all of a sudden I heard I saw the red lights flashing on the PA, and I heard flight attendants to the front of the aircraft defend the cockpit door.
It was the tone of his voice and the urgency of the announcement that I think really sprung everybody into action.
I went right to the front, and when I got there, the perpetrator was kicking the cockpit door. And I yelled at him, and I said, "Sir, what is the problem?"
He would look at you and he wouldn't say a word.
The purser was standing by his jump seat, along with another flight attendant who'd been working in first class, Carmen Munz. I was standing behind the purser, the captain was standing behind the purser, and the person, Kevin Murphy, was trying to calm the gentleman down.
Being right next to Kevin and lunging forward a little bit, Kevin kind of put his hand up and had said to me, "Mark, call the cockpit and let them know what's happening outside."
So Kevin had established a little rapport with him already. I just let Kevin do the speaking, and it looked like we were going to talk him out of it.
I had his attention. He had stopped what he was doing, which was, kicking the door. So I immediately said to him, "Would you like a glass of water?" And the thought process was there that I could get him calmed down, have a drink of water, calm down, and just see if we can work this whole thing out.
The A flight attendant was able to gain his attention. It looked like he was going to be able to calm him down momentarily. The individual apparently accepted a cup of water from the flight attendant, drank the water, and then made another dash for the door, at which time I removed my face from the viewport and threw my shoulder against the door again to brace for the impact. This time, however, rather than feeling an impact, the individual came through the bottom panel of the door.
Like a rabbit going for its hole, he turned and darted really quick for the lower half of the door. And my reaction was to jump.
So all of a sudden, as I'm looking over my shoulder to see what else is going on, I heard a scream that he's in the cockpit. And at that point, when I turned, Kevin had already tackled him and had him by the feet. And I think I had to reach slightly under the cockpit door. I knew I'd have to get a good grip, so I got my hand under his belt.
He was approximately halfway into the cockpit from his waist up. He starts trying to raise up, and I was able to pin him against the cockpit jump seat with my right leg and knee. At this point, the other co-pilot is encouraging me with a great deal of enthusiasm to strike the individual with the trash axe. As I started to do this, I realized that my leg was now in the path of the axe should I strike a glancing blow or miss altogether. So to avoid the chance that I would end up impaling myself with the axe, I turned the axe broadside and struck the individual in the top or back of the head with the flat side of the axe. I fully expected this to knock the individual, if not unconscious, at least somewhat senseless. It didn't have that effect. He continued to struggle. I immediately struck him at least twice more, perhaps 3 times more. We're not sure. Before I could strike another time, the folks outside apparently were able to get hold of him well enough that they were able to pull him back through the opening through which he had come.
We had pulled him out. He was prone on the floor. He had jumped in head first, so his head was still facing the cockpit door, but he was on his stomach. And then everyone was on top of him, and then the captain asked for the handcuffs, the flex cuffs.
After the individual was removed from the cockpit and the captain was attempting to restrain him, he called for me to hand his hat through the opening in the bottom of the door because he knew that's where his handcuffs were.
As I went to cuff his left hand, he grabbed the hold of the cuffs and had quite a strong grip. He evidently wasn't fazed much by the blows he'd taken bluntly from the axe. And I just gave up on trying to get the cuffs out of his hand. We have plenty more up there, so I asked Mike to throw me his set back. And he even got a hold of Mike's set in his other hand so tight that I was about to give up and just say, well, throw me Scott's set, or, I have another set in my flight bag I keep. But at that point, he'd let go with his left hand that I was able to get the cuffs on his left hand.
While this was going on, Flight Attendant Therese Canal was making an announcement in Spanish to the rest of the aircraft that the situation was now under control and for everyone to calm down. Again, Flight Attendant Mark Worden, who was on the interphone with the cockpit, continued to relay what was going on outside of the door.
They had asked me specifically, let us know when he is restrained, because they were not planning on coming out that door. One of the guy's acquaintances who was on the business trip with him up until Argentina, he had come up and he was also talking to me saying, I know him, he's okay. He's just been depressed the last couple of days. Well, this was information that immediately was sent up front, and I guess it was just to help the guys get an idea of who they are dealing with.
We were able to get the flex cuffs on him, and we used seat belts. We used another set of flex cuffs around his legs.
There were announcements made throughout the plane calling for medical help, calling for a doctor, and anyone who could help us.
At that point, once he was restrained completely, about 5 or 6 guys took him to the 15E in business class and restrained him to the seat there, and then he was attended by a psychiatrist who was on board and doctors just checking him out. And I guess actually trying to calm him down, even though he was a bit coherent, but he was awake. The eyes were open.
Bruce Robbins and Sean Delaney were standing guard over the passenger as the purser had asked them to do, along with the doctor, the psychiatrist, and 2 of the first-class passengers.
I wanted to make very certain that he wasn't going to get turned loose back there. I instructed at least 6 different people that the restraints were not to come off of him.
At this time, once the situation was secure, I got on the ACARS and I informed the company that we had had somebody who actually penetrated the cockpit door. Company got back with me. They called me via the SATCOM, and I was also talking to the captain at the time, and he informed me that there was a American intelligence agent in the back, American intelligence officer, who had helped him with the organizing passengers and some of the resistance.
After we had him cuffed and situation a little more stable, I had the one phone in my left hand speaking in the cockpit, and one of the flight attendants helped me with my credit card to get the airphone to speak to the dispatcher, and then the dispatcher patching people in it. And obviously we had the technology going for us, a lot of good communication there.
All these groups started to form, passengers and flight attendants alike, and they started doing all these jobs. They started, finding his bags, seeing who was hurt, taking down names. All of these things occurred, and it was great because it was facilitating everything that needed to be done without really any leadership. They just went and did it.
As I talked to our dispatcher, Gloria, I said, we didn't have the fuel to go back to Miami. And I said, you've got the location that I've been back here sleeping. So she came up with where we were and who had good weather, what would be our options.
At about 45 minutes or so after the beginning of the incident, and that's purely an estimation, the captain had things settled down enough that he felt like he could return. We were very worried that the cockpit door may not close properly again if we opened it, so rather than do that, the captain elected to just come through the opening at the bottom of the door, which he was very easily able to do.
So right away I just started talking to Scott and Mike about where we were, how we were doing on time and fuel and that, what the weather was in Santa Cruz and in Buenos Aires. Once we got caught up on that, I kind of looked at them too because, Mike had his break, but Scott had 0 break. And it just seemed like, no one was going to be able to sleep from then on. So, I just told them if they were comfortable and felt they could close their eyes or whatever in the cockpit to let us know, and we'd try and get little breaks because no one wound up with any break. And I just knew arriving down there, I was more concerned at that point about just the flight than the security end of it. That, we had some tired people and stressed people, but determined, they were doing okay, and we just pressed on to Buenos Aires.
At this point, we were approximately 3.5 to 4 hours out of Buenos Aires. The purser asked us to do the breakfast service a little early so that we could all be secured, everything put away, and we would be more at ease when we landed the aircraft.
When we landed in Buenos Aires, we were met by both Argentine military and police forces, as well as some paramedics who were the first on board the aircraft. Once they had made sure that the individual was properly restrained, they removed him from the aircraft under guard. After that, the passengers who were not involved in the incident were allowed to deplane. At that time, there were quite a few both U.S. and Argentine officials on board the aircraft. They kept the crew and the individuals who were directly involved in subduing the individual on board the aircraft for a short briefing. They arranged for us to have some rooms inside the airport where we would be debriefed on the incident.
It took about, I would say it probably took about another 3 hours, maybe 2.5 to 3 hours before all the writing and interviews and everything were done. And then we proceeded to our hotel room from there.
The entire crew of Flight 855 deadheaded back to Miami the following day. The passenger was returned to Miami that same evening and was met at the airport by the appropriate officials.
Quite a story. Quite a story. Ladies and gentlemen, Captain Dan Kirk.
In the post-September 11th environment, to find someone trying to kick your cockpit door in, I'm very thankful I jumped to what was a wrong conclusion. I was almost certain we were going to face a number of well-trained terrorists working as a team. As it was, we were better prepared than one individual working alone. We did work as a team, and we had much better training. The thing I've taken away from this is that we need to be better prepared than our opponent if we expect to win. And in the case of terrorists, it's going to be tough to close that training gap. They're very well trained, they're highly motivated. They know our numbers, they can outnumber us. The thing I think we need to do is to tilt the scale in our favor, and United's taken the first step there with non-lethal weapons. They've trained us with tasers. The idea is they'll be in the cockpit in a lockbox, which will preclude any problems with jurisdiction or weapon retention. That after the bars up in the door, we'll have a key which will be issued to each pilot with a serial number on it. And it's a good first step, but I think may be inappropriate considering what we're up against of using non-lethal force. I know you've probably heard a lot of individuals concerned about putting lethal force in the hands of a pilot, but that night Mike Covington had lethal force in his hand. He could have used the sharp end of the axe on the first blow. As it was, in the heat of battle in the middle of night, not knowing what we were facing, of course now we know all the answers. But that night, Mike had the presence of mind to know that the situation hadn't come to using lethal force just yet. So I think that speaks highly of our group, that we can be trusted, that when it comes time, we'll know when to use it, but also we know when not to. And I think I'll let Scott and Mike kind of fill in the details there. The other thing I'll just point out real quickly, Scott had a very tough job to do that night. Scott, when I originally met him way prior to September 11th, was already taking self-defense classes, and with the possibility of maybe having to use it in the cockpit at some time. As it turned out, his duty that evening was to fly the airplane, which sounds pretty simple. In an emergency, we're all trained. Somebody's got to fly, and of course, being in a safety environment that most of you are, you're well aware of the accidents where no one was flying the airplane when there was something quite simple wrong with it. That night it was a very complex, very, well, at the time we thought we were up against terrorists, and I'm sure the hearts were racing in that, and Scott had the presence of mind to stick with and fly the aircraft, and as we all know, that's a tough job to stay out of whatever else is going on. And I'll turn it over to Mike next.
I'll just very quickly say, in answer to the question I get most often, why is the guy still walking around? Some of it was cut off there on the film. When the individual came in low under the bottom of the door, it surprised me a little bit. I had been watching the door at the top look like it might give way, and I was expecting maybe something reaching in through the top, or perhaps the door even breaking over the bar. When he came in through the bottom, very dark outside, very dark inside, I wasn't even aware that that panel had opened. When he came sliding in under my feet, my first reaction was to try to keep him on the floor, so I pinned him down by the throat with my knee and leg. At that point, I started to make a blow to his head, and I realized that with him struggling and trying to get up, and I was trying to keep enough weight on him to keep him down but not to lose my balance. If I missed, I was going to take myself out with the axe. So rather than take that chance, at which time Scott would have been on his own to fight the guy off, I elected to try to knock him out by using the broad side of the axe. It didn't work. Watched too many cowboy movies, I guess. Popping a guy on the top of the head doesn't always knock him out. But as it turned out, I'm glad it wasn't necessary to kill the individual. But I assure you that had he started to get away from me, or I felt like I wasn't going to be able to keep him on the floor, that was coming. Had he stayed in the cockpit any longer than he did, he may not have survived. Hard to say, but all in all, we're very happy that the crew and the passengers all arrived safely and unharmed. So I also would like to reiterate what Dan said, that Scott probably had the toughest job of any of us. He was forced to sit in the seat, unable to act in his own defense, while Dan and I both were able to respond to the particular situation. Scott was stuck with a very difficult job of paying attention to flying the airplane, and he did an excellent job. Scott?
Thank you. Well, I was very fortunate that night. Dan happened to mention that I had taken some hand-to-hand self-defense courses. 30 hours, it's $60 a pop. It was kind of expensive. And I got to tell you, after that incident, I felt somewhat kind of deprived because I had invested all this money and I didn't get the opportunity to use it. Maybe that's better. Probably would have hurt myself trying to do something. But it was a very stressful situation to be up there and to just, in effect, to fly the airplane, to rely on other people, to turn your back on somebody trying to break in the cockpit door. And you knew if they were getting in, they weren't taking you to Havana for cigars. But I was very fortunate that night because I was flying with two pilots who I could rely on, and I couldn't think of a better captain or a better first officer than I could have been with than Dan Kurt and Mike Covington. Thanks, guys.
We've got a time for a couple of questions. We're running pretty close to on schedule, but if there are any questions.
Scott, Gary Cook with US Air. Congratulations. You guys did a great job, and I appreciate that. We all appreciate that. As far as flying, talking, were you talking to anybody? Were you talking to other airplanes, or did you have time, frame of mind to?
That was brought up by TK. Thank you. Good question. That was brought up by TK. They wanted to know, the instructors out there, when they showed this video to recurrent flight attendants and pilots, apparently there were some questions. Did Loftman talk to ATC? And quite frankly, if you've ever flown to South America, you're on your own down there. I didn't talk to ATC because my rationale was there's poor radio communications, as Mike points out. And secondly, what can they do for you? And I'll give you a real quick example. The other night we're coming out of Buenos Aires, and we have a American Airlines 767 in front of us. And I guess they're about 30 miles in front of us. We're talking to Cordoba Control. They have smoke in the cockpit. They come on the radios. They say, Cordoba Control, we have smoke in the cockpit. We need a lower altitude. Dead silence. This is Cordoba Control. This is American 900. We have smoke in the cockpit. We need a lower altitude. We need the weather at Ascension. Dead silence. They make a third call, and the guy comes back and says, stand by. So what we did is we got on the A cars, we pulled up the weather for ASU, and they, I believe they finally started their descent, then they got their clearance. But to answer the question, when you're flying in South America, especially deep South America, quite frankly, it was the middle of the night, 4 in the morning, 37,000 feet over the Amazon jungle, and when it comes to ATC, we were on our own as far as I was concerned.
The ACARS and SATCOM communications that we have with the company is very good. The company has a crisis control center, and from there they can contact just about anybody we need to talk to, including the air traffic controllers, because oftentimes it's not so much that they have problems talking to us verbally, it's that the radios kind of come and go with different conditions. So they may be there, they may just not hear us, and we may not hear them, or both. But we did immediately notify the company, who then was able to notify everybody that needed to know almost instantaneously.
Gentleman, Kai Jackson with WJZ in Baltimore. Given the situation that you had an adequate piece of equipment to restrain the intruder into the cockpit. Do any or all of you support guns or weapons in the cockpit?
I support him because, quite frankly, had Mike not been physically adept as he was, had the perpetrator come in standing up rather than he was on his hands and knees, made him very vulnerable, and had there been more than one perpetrator, quite frankly, in my opinion, the situation would have turned out far differently, and we probably wouldn't be here today. So yes, I am in favor of the last line of defense, firearms in the cockpit, yes.
I think all three of us are in favor, as you heard me allude to, that we need to have an advantage over them, and we certainly aren't going to close the training gap or the numbers on them. They can outnumber us. We need the weapons, and I think non-lethal force isn't appropriate when you look at what's at stake there.
The only thing I would like to add is that if someone gets through the cockpit door, and so far as I know, that's where they're talking about the guns being available is only inside the cockpit. If someone gets in the cockpit, all the other things have failed, and now you've got two outcomes. They win or you win. If they win, then you're looking at the fighters coming to make sure that you don't do any more damage. So it would give us one last opportunity to stop them that we might otherwise not have.
Yeah, gentlemen, Ed Beardman with Northwest Airlines, and I would like to also compliment you on a job well done. But you mentioned a minute ago about SATCOM, all right? What kind of benefit, and I'm sure the captain has, or but all of you may have, but flying in that environment without SATCOM communications, do you think that the help that you would have received from your company and from other folks would have been accessible to you without the SATCOM?
I'd like to take that. I started flying South America in '92 with the 47s with HF, and sometimes we couldn't get a redispatch. We were worried that we wouldn't even wind up at our destination. With the SATCOM that night, it was very reassuring that the dispatcher had the big picture, all the weather at all the airports that we wanted, and that they weren't no-tammed out, that we had options there. And also the FBI was patched in, and we wanted to know about this individual. We definitely had his identity. I wanted to confirm the identity of a CIA officer that was on the airplane that was helping me, and I was able to do that. And the FBI also was able to tell us this individual had no record with Interpol or any other. So that was very reassuring to have communications. There was a lot of help there. Also, they were able to patch in the FBI down in Buenos Aires for our arrival, that the individual was never allowed into the country. There were a lot of good things that happened because we were able to communicate so clearly. Without it, we would have, there's some nights with the HF we would not have had all that going for us.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. Thank you for being here. Thank you for telling the story, and absolutely a job well done. Thank you very much. The events of September 11th are woven throughout our forum this year. And one of the things that, as it unfolded, we had so many airplanes in flight from Europe and from the Pacific that were not coming into U.S. airspace, that it drove home the point that the U.S. and the Canadians are very closely linked countries. I think it's the longest undefended border